Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Should we wait another minute or should we get started?
I think
Give it one more minute.
Maybe one more minute?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, we're really excited to do this. We have so much to cover. I hope we don't go over. Yeah, we'll wait another minute and just let folks come in. Okay. Yeah.
All right. How about, should we call time?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, good afternoon and welcome. Thanks for joining us for our presentation today on /fanfiction and Yaoi Manga. Today we're going to be talking about fandom and sexuality in the archives. And if you're not familiar with / or Yaoi, we'll discuss what these are and how and why we collect these in the archives. And speaking of that, we're actually going to start with a poll. So the question that we'd like to know, that we'd like an answer from you is, are you familiar with / and or boys love fandoms? So I'm going to launch the poll now. So hopefully everyone can see this. And I'll just give you all a minute to respond to this question, and then I will share the results. Oh, okay.
I think we're still waiting.
Yeah, we still have a few more. Okay.
And we're still getting people in the waiting room, actually. So, like,
oh, okay.
I leave it even open a few seconds more, just so that they can.
Yeah. Ooh, this is so interesting. I'm getting a sneak peek. And
should we repeat it for anyone that just came in? We have a poll running, so it should be popping up on your screen.
We have a poll running right now, so hopefully everyone who's joining us can see and access the poll, and it looks like they can from what I can see. So I'll just give you all, looks like we're still waiting for maybe a few more people to respond. I'll give you a few more seconds and then I'll share the results. You've got 38 out of 41. There's more joining now.
Oh, cool. Okay. And by the way, we purposely left this question kind of open. So even if you've only heard of it, but you don't really know what it is, or if you're like a hardcore fan, you can answer yes to both of those. Like, we just want to get an idea of where folks are coming from, what kind of knowledge they might already have.
Yes. So actually, it looks like we're not moving up. So I'm going to go ahead and end and share the results.
Okay.
And hopefully you can all see this. I'm sharing the results
now.
now.
Boy.
Yeah, so it looks like 97% of everyone here is familiar with / and or boys love fandoms, which is great. But don't feel bad if you're not, because this is a great opportunity to learn more about them. And even if you are familiar with these forms, hopefully you'll learn something new today as well. So thanks for participating in our poll. I'm going to stop sharing. I'll admit and move on. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to introduce our speakers today, who are both colleagues of mine in Special Collections here at UCR. Today you're going to be hearing from Sandy Enriquez, who is our Special Collections Public Services Outreach and Community Engagement Librarian. And you're also going to be hearing from Andrew Lippert, who is our Special Collections Processing Archivist. So there are resident experts at UCR on boys love and / fanfiction. So you're in good hands. And before we get to that, I would like to invite all of you to participate in this discussion using our Padlet. The link is over here on the left-hand side of your screen. I think you can see that. But I'll also drop a link in the chat. And this works similar to how a Google Doc works. In case you're not familiar with it, anyone can contribute to the document. You don't need any special permissions. And all of the comments are anonymous. So you can just add your comment where it says add comment here at the bottom of each box. So yeah, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from. You can type in any questions that you think of throughout the presentation here. Let us know if you're a fan, what type of fandom you participate in. And here on the right, we have a section for recommendations for manga titles, authors, or series, or any information that we could use to find new boys love material to acquire for special collections at UCR. And just a note, we can't guarantee that we'll be able to buy everything that you suggest, but it would be helpful to us to know that there's an audience for certain authors and titles and so forth. So we're really eager to hear your recommendations. And you can enter that information over here in the Padlet on the right. And then lastly, on the left, there's a link to a survey that we're going to also mention at the end of the presentation. We'd really love to hear your feedback about the event, if you wouldn't mind filling that out. And I'll drop a link to that in the chat at the end of the discussion as well. And I'll be monitoring the Padlet as well as the chat in Zoom throughout the presentation. So you can participate in either of those spaces however you feel comfortable. And before I turn this over to our speakers, I just want to note that this presentation does contain explicit content and images, so we just ask that everyone be aware of that and be respectful, particularly during those parts of the presentation. And without further ado, I will turn this over to Sandy and Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Andrea. So hi, everyone. My name is Sandy. Thank you all for coming. I want to just start with a statement of solidarity and just acknowledge that we're living in really difficult, unprecedented times right now. As members of the UCR community, we stand with Black Lives Matters against racial injustice, police brutality, and other human rights violations. We also recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, as well as their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. So even though we're now meeting in these digital spaces, we invite you to learn whose ancestral lands you're physically located on by visiting the website nativeland.ca. Next slide, please. And this is a general agenda of what we're going to cover today. We've already started with some of the introductions, but we're going to dive into the fandoms next, and we're going to do brief readings to give you an idea of what slash and boys love manga looks like, though it sounds like a lot of folks are already familiar with it. And number 3, we're going to talk about the academic research that has been done into these fandom communities. We'll talk about past research and more current research as well. And then we'll pivot back to UCR and talk a little bit about the materials that we have in our collections and how they arrived there. And we will try to leave time for Q&A at the end. So if you want to drop any questions in the chat or put them in the Padlet, that would be great. Next, please. All right, and I'd like to go ahead and read a little bit of our abstract. So today's presentation is based on an article that my colleague Andrew and I recently published, and the article was all about advocating for more libraries and archives to collect fandom materials, specifically slash and BL or boys love manga. So unfortunately, we're not going to have time to go over all the stuff that we covered in the article, but we will cover some of the main points. And I'll just read the highlighted portion here. Slash and BL, or boys love, refer to fan-made or commercially published works of male homosexual erotica or romance, historically made for the pleasure and consumption of women. These fandoms have been a minor subject of academic scholarship for years, though few archives or libraries are actively acquiring them. In this presentation, we will explore the value and the challenges associated with collecting materials containing taboo subject matter. Next, please.
All right, hello, I'm Andrew. And so I just want to take off from where Sandy left us there, talking about this taboo material. And this is an excerpt from donor correspondence when we acquired the KS collection, the Kirk-Spock collection that we have. And I just want to emphasize this piece at the bottom. One thing I do want to be clear about, you do understand these are KS, as in Kirk and Spock are lovers. I have found that in a few cases, when I approach people, they backed off when I was explicit about the contents. And I think that this demonstrates some of the difficulty that people can run into, both in terms of donations and in acquisitions when you're talking about materials that are sort of outside of the traditional norms of collecting. And with Slash and Boys Love, we're dealing with marginal communities or marginalized communities, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through the presentation. And these types of materials and communities are often sort of off the radar for academics and special collections in a lot of ways. But we do want to note that so this was a decade or so ago that this donation came to us, and a lot has changed since then. And so we're looking at things with a very different eye in terms of collection development and our perspectives in terms of building our collections than the way people necessarily did at the time that this donation happened. And so, you know, for instance, with this collection, it's hard to say that the collection was acquired because it was Slash. And a lot of times it's sort of, it was a tertiary benefit or sort of a happy coincidence that it ended up being Slash, you know, from our perspective now that we have it. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as the presentation goes on. Slide.
Yeah. So what you'll hear me say time and time again today is that there are so many similarities between the Slash and the Boys Love BL fandoms. Unfortunately, one of the biggest similarities between them is the marginalization that these subcultures have faced. And this is kind of reflected in this term that we hear a lot in the BL fandom, which is fuyoshi, or Japanese for rotten girls. So this kind of came into play in the 2000s, and it was used as an insult to female fans of BL, you know, implying that there's something wrong or like rotten about being interested in these materials. And we actually see variants of it too. So there's fudanchi, so rotten boy, or fujin, or rotten person for non-binary identifying peoples. But recently, this term is becoming reclaimed by the community and is being used in a more positive light. And we see it a lot in like meme and internet culture. I also wanted to point out this infographic on the right-hand side, which is in Spanish, because the BL fandom is not just limited to the US or Japan. It's really a global phenomenon. It's also really popular in Latin America. So I want to point out, like, this is a fandom that has continued to grow and flourish, like, and it's been around for many decades. So it's really awesome. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to get into the Yaoi, or Boys Love manga. So next. And I'm going to read like a really brief excerpt from one of our mangas that we have here at UCR. And this one I chose, well, it's by Yugi Yamada, and it's an excerpt from her manga, I Have an Excuse Too. And this was previewed in the actual manga Picnic. So I'll just read the main the main speech bubbles, and I'll leave the rest of it to your imagination because I can't do it justice. But another thing to keep in mind is that manga is traditionally read from right to left. So if you're following along, you know, just keep that in mind. So, oh, and the only context you kind of need to know for this is that these two characters are roommates and formerly just platonic friends. All right, so let's dive in. Who cares if your first love, first kiss, and first screw are the same person? Are you stupid? What? Yeah, you're stupid. A complete moron. I don't want to hear that from you. Man, you're dumb. Who'd want to be with you anyway? I've been holding back for you, and you don't care. You sure talk a lot, virgin. Come here, I'll put it on for you. It's okay. Next. Just hurry up and make me feel good. I'll try. What a weird face. Shut up. Next slide. All right. I told him I'd let him off easy since this was his first time. It was my first time with someone who was holding back for my sake. I hit him anyway. After that day, we started sleeping in the same room, but our fights were still stupid. So yeah, like I know most of the folks here are actually fans, so that's really exciting. But for the folks that are kind of new to the fandom or not familiar with it, I'll talk a little bit about why I chose this particular excerpt. I think this is a good example of the two kind of sides of the spectrum of boys' love. So on one side, we have like a more soft, romantic, kind of innocent kind of love. And we see that in some parts of this manga. Hopefully you can see my cursor, but when we see like the little chibi forms, the little cutesy forms of the characters, like here. Oh yeah, because yeah, there you go. Somewhere in the top left-hand corner, yeah, there you go, of the page. So we have more of like the fun and playful kind of interludes in between the sections that are a little bit more, kind of like hot, kind of interesting and passionate. So you see those two sides. I also want to point out that something that we see a lot in manga are author's notes or like author interludes. So the author will point out, like they'll just pop in a little message here and there and just give you more information about the characters or kind of an explanation about why they did certain things. And I kind of showed one of the notes here on the left-hand side because I wanted to point out that we get some extra info about the characters themselves. And you'll notice one of them is, seme and one of them is uke. So people in the fandom will know like this seme uke translates or correlates to what we call in the West like a top or a bottom partner. And this is like a super common trope in the BL fandom, but it does hint at some of the things about the fandom that might be a little bit more problematic. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Next slide. Okay, so what is boys' love and BL? Like I described it before, I kind of see it as a spectrum. So on one side, we have the shonenai, which literally translates to boys' love. And this emphasizes the soft, the romantic, the very innocent parts of the relationship. And this can be between male characters of any demographic. It doesn't have to be just boys. And on the other side, we have the yaoi, or the more graphic, more sexually explicit side of the BL fandom. And folks say that this term yaoi came from as an acronym for this phrase of no climax, no point, no meaning. And that's supposed to mean, like the whole point of the story is the sex. So we don't really care about the storyline. We don't care about like character development. We just want to get to the good stuff. So you can see that that's what that's about. And boys' love is kind of an umbrella term in the US to encompass all of the spectrum. So it's important to note that manga and anime can kind of fluctuate. It can start on one side of the spectrum and then go to the other side, especially when you have a series and, the characters get to know each other. We might get more explicit scenes as the series progresses. So I actually took this picture of this manga in the middle from Barnes & Noble recently, and I was excited to see that they use the boys' love terminology. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide. So it's important to emphasize that scholars have traditionally thought of the BL fandom as by straight women for straight women. And this is in contrast to what we in the West call bara, or what is known in Japan simply as gay manga. And that's manga specifically written by gay identifying men. And as you can tell, the aesthetic of it is very different than what we see in the BL fandom, mostly. Next slide. All right, so now I'm going to try and do a really brief timeline of BL. And this is such an amazing topic, and I wish I could have more time to speak on it, but I'll try and cover a lot of stuff. So we started in the 1970s, and this is when we get the publication of one of the first shonenai manga, which is the poem of Wind and Trees. And you can see an image of it here on the left-hand side. This coincides with the rise of female mangaka, or female artists, manga artists, most notably the Year 24 group. And they were known as that because they were all born in the same year. But this is the first time that we start seeing women enter the manga industry. And previous to this, there were manga specifically geared towards girls and women, but it was always written by men. So it had a different perspective. With the Year 24 group, they revolutionized the girls manga or shoujo manga industry. And that's when we start seeing more of this play with gender, play with sexuality in this boys' love fandom. So similar to the Slash fandom, fans were making their own comics from the start, and these were known as doujinshi. And so popular doujinshi artists who had accumulated their own fan base were hired by professional BL magazines like June to produce their own commercial work. In the 90s, we start to see the community really flourish with the advent of the internet. So the internet changed the game. It made it possible to circulate translations. It introduced the US audiences to the BL fandom. It just made it much more accessible. We also see a lot of the popular BL manga being adapted into animes, which is a really good sign that it's a success, and there's a demand for it. We also see the very first academic article being written about BL fandom, and that was by Dr. Sharon Kinsella, and she wrote her dissertation about the changing manga industry for the University of Oxford. In the 2000s, Tokyo Pop becomes the first US company to publish a BL manga, and so that made it possible for people to buy BL at their local Barnes & Noble and not just have to look online. We also see a lot of conventions start to emerge in the US, such as YaoiCon, Yaoi Expo, and OnCon. In the 2010s, we start to see more of a demand for inclusivity and more realistic portrayals of queer and non-binary characters in anime and manga. So I've listed a few here, but I'm really curious to hear, what you guys have, or if you have other suggestions as well. We'd love to hear it. All right, next slide. So I think it's important to talk about the fact that, the BL fandom is so complex. Like on one hand, we really see it as an empowering fandom that's allowing women a way to express and, engage with sexuality in ways that they probably weren't able to before. But on the other hand, we can also see that sometimes it can fetishize or be too voyeuristic of LGBTQ+ or queer communities. I really like this quote from Crystal Marie. And so some of you may be familiar with her. She's part of the YouTube channel, Get in the Robot. And we actually quote this in the article too, but I'll read it because I think she does a great job of kind of exploring that complexity. So she says, BL is not written to appeal to or to accurately reflect the experiences of a queer audience, but rather a heterosexual one. It doesn't show gay couples, it shows the desires of straight women. As Fujobait, or fan service for Fuyoshi, becomes a trend in mainstream anime, it can sometimes blur the line with queerbaiting. It can easily slip into fetishizing the LGBTQ+ community. Many feel that BL itself is a kind of queerbaiting, although many feel that BL is also about female sexual empowerment and catering to the female gaze, which almost always complicates the issue. Especially if you're like me, you're both a Fuyoshi and an ally. And I've included a screenshot here of The Descendants of Darkness. As some of you may know, this isn't explicitly BL manga, but there is some like Fujobaiting in there. There's some implication, that there's more intimacy between some of these male characters. So the fan service is there. But the reason that can be problematic is because you're trying to attract a certain audience and support from a certain audience without actually, increasing your diversity or your representation of queer or LGBTQ+ individuals. So next slide, please. Oh, I'll pass it off to Andrew from here.
Okay, so I'm gonna take over and do a similar introduction for Slash fan fiction. Go to the next slide. Okay, so similarly, we're going to start out with just a quick reading here so you can see sort of what we're dealing with in terms of Slash fan fiction. The bulk of it was stories and texts like this. And this is from the fanzine Obscene, the first issue, which was in March 1977. And this is one of the earliest fanzines devoted to Slash. And as you can see, it deals with the Star Trek universe. And so we're just like a page or two into the story here at this point. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of setup. So Kirk, Spock, and Dr. McCoy have crash landed on a planet. They were injured, and they took shelter in a cave. Kirk and Spock had an interaction overnight, and Spock is now waking up the morning after the crash. He's injured and sort of dazed and confused. So we're going to start here at the second paragraph. The first thing he discovered was that both of them were nearly naked. Bewildered, he ran his hand over Kirk's hip, trying to find cloth. Missing shirts and boots he could understand, but why were his uniform trousers pulled halfway down his thighs? And why were Kirk's torn away as far as he could feel? Definitely torn, he concluded, as his fingers encountered the frayed end of a ripped belt. I am the only person present with enough strength to tear belt leather. Apprehension shivered up his spine, difficult to control. I was semi-conscious at best. Did I hurt him? Seriously worried now, he slid his hand between their tight-pressed bellies and felt for damage. Almost at once, he found something alarming. Sticky? That couldn't be sweat. It must be blood. Wondering angrily how McCoy could have failed to notice such a symptom of damage, Spock flung caution aside and slid exploratory fingers over Kirk's abdomen, upper thighs, genitals, and barely had time to determine that there was no external injury. Kirk stretched, sighed, and rolled hard against him, neatly trapping Spock's hand in his groin. So that gives you a little bit of, yeah, it gives you a little bit of an impression of how these slash stories go, especially at the beginning. And I'll say that the rest of the story explores, so obviously Kirk and Spock had a sexual interaction, and first time for both of them, right? Or at least together. And so the rest of the story is sort of grappling, the two of them grappling with the sort of the fallout and the consequences of their engagement with each other. And each one wrestling with the sort of the mental image and the ideas or the ideals that they hold themselves to, right? Kirk as a Starfleet captain and Spock as, you know, the proper Vulcan. So that's the way the rest of the story goes. There's quite a bit of emotional conflict, and you know, you get inside both of their heads, and towards the end, they do sort of not reconcile, but they sort of come to terms with their feelings for each other, and they do end up together at the very end. And I should also make a note here. So this was an early one, and it starts with this crash landing. And this is a very typical trope, especially within early Star Trek slash. You know, they crash or they get marooned on a planet on an away mission. Usually one of them is injured and has to be cared for by the other, and things develop from there. Go ahead for the next slide. All right, so we'll just do a quick rundown of what we know from you know, the early history of slash. There's not a lot of really good concrete evidence, and some of the best information we have comes from sort of internal fan research of the community. But what we do know, right, is that it originated with Star Trek, the original series in the 60s, and that the slash fandom began in the UK around the time that the franchise was canceled, which was 1969. And the earliest stories were circulated by hand from person to person, and it took a few years before the first printed story made its way into any sort of zines or print. That story was a fragment out of time, and it appeared in the Star Trek adult fanzine Grupp in 1974. So it took, you know, 5-6 years before you see this first published story, but it was only another year or two before zines, you know, more stories started to get published. And then in 1976, you had your first dedicated slash zine, which was Alternative Epilogue to Orion in 1976. The next year, there were multiple zines, and by 1978, you started to see anthologies. So the growth was very quick. Slash did not stay just with the Star Trek universe. The next slash pairing was Starsky and Hutch from the same television show, which was in the second half of the 1970s. And then fast forwarding a bit, in the 1990s, with the popularity of the Xena TV series, you get the first fem slash between Xena and Gabrielle. And then, you know, in the 2000s and up to now, basically every cult franchise or any popular TV show has some kind of slash pairings. You know, if you go to the Buffyverse, you can find a bunch. Buffy and Faith is one popular one. For example, in Lord of the Rings, you've got Legolas and Aragorn. And these are just one example. There are many in all of these franchises. In Game of Thrones, you can find slash about Jon Snow and Jaime Lannister. And then from the new Star Wars trilogy, you've got slash pairings of Poe and Finn. And if you see on the picture here on the right, you can see, there's fan art as well. And there's a long tradition dating back to the very beginnings of Kirk Spock slash with the wonderful art. Next slide. So similarly with the boys' love, when we think about who's creating slash, academics found when they first started to look at the slash community that it was pretty much entirely dominated by women. And then even a decade later, if you look at the second quote there by Anne Kustritz, she made a similar observation, right? So this was primarily a female-dominated audience, and Kustritz made the observation, sort of added this economic component and this dissatisfaction element. We should make a note here as well that despite Kirk and Spock being the origins and the primary focus of a lot of this early slash, there were other characters involved from time to time. I've run across a few stories with Dr. McCoy as a protagonist. And as you can see from these images on the right-hand side, that it wasn't always just male-male. So slash is traditionally, it's that same-sex relationship, but there was still this view within the community of Kirk and Spock both being heterosexual men. And so you did still see them engage in that heterosexual relationship as well. It just wasn't terribly common. Everybody was more interested in Kirk and Spock's relationship. But as some of these early academics observed, right, and the same with the boys' love, it wasn't necessarily about homosexuality or gender. And a lot of the fans, like I said, held this conception that they, Kirk and Spock were still heterosexual despite having a relationship with each other. But we should say that these observations were from the very early periods of research into this area. And that was, 30 years ago. So there's been a lot that has developed and changed both within academics and the community itself. Next slide, perfect. Okay, so just to reiterate this, I wanted to take a quick look at another early fanzine. So this is Thrust from 1978, so we're still looking at some of the earliest fanzines. And this is editorial, sort of editorialization at the beginning. This is the front matter. And you can see sort of the subtitle on the left, right? It's an exploration of the Kirk-Spock relationship, right? So this is right away, right? We're couching this as an exploration of a relationship, not, about the sex necessarily. In the middle here, the first two paragraphs, right? The editor, Carol Frisbee, is asserting, right, that it's a celebration and exploration of love. So Thrust is a celebration and exploration of love. Love in general and love in specific. Love in friendship, love in the traditional romantic sense, love in adversity, and love is the highest value, ultimately defeating adversity, right? So this is really about the relationship between two individuals. And on the third panel here on the right at the top, you can see it's even more explicit that it's not about the homosexuality, right? The theme, as some might argue, is not homosexuality. It is love between two people who have made their own progressions from sharing life, time, mind, thought, and soul to sharing bodies. Love between two people who happen to be both male. And one more thing to note here that's sort of unique to the Kirk-Spock slash is the Vulcan mind meld, which does add an extra level of intimacy that is absent from a normal human relationship. And it is a very heavily used trope within the Kirk-Spock slash. Next slide. Okay, so we've given you a good look at sort of what is BL and what is slash. And so we thought we would just do a little bit of a compare and contrast real quick, just to, because there are a lot of similarities, but there are still some differences too. So, right, we know that they're both same-sex relationships, that's the focus, and that they were originally both created by women for women. Both fandoms found a home in digital spaces, and it allowed their communities to flourish. All right, there's that freedom of the online space led to quite a bit of growth within both communities. Both fandoms have been marginalized, both sort of from larger fandoms and also within, sort of within Star Trek fandom. The Slash, the Kirk Spock was marginalized, and then within the manga communities, the Boys Love was also marginalized. And both fandoms certainly represent a very open-minded perspective, right? One that was in many ways years or decades ahead of mainstream culture, and in a lot of ways still is. And we should also note that Slash and Yaoi are sometimes used interchangeably in the United States and within Western fandoms. And I will hand it off to Sandy.
Yeah, so I'll cover a few of the differences. And, these are kind of blurred too. These aren't set in stone. I'd say nothing in the BL fandom is set in stone. But there's obviously some regional, some cultural norms that are different, given that BL manga originated in Japan in totally different cultural contexts. We also sometimes see differences in the aesthetics. So in the BL manga, we have way more of a gender bending, of a non-binary, like Bishonen or the beautiful boy characters, so a more androgynous look. And in the Slash fiction, fan fiction, we tend to see more of like the traditional masculine look, though it depends. Sometimes they also break out of that norm. And then I would say the biggest difference is that the BL fandom found commercial success in a way that Slash wasn't able to. So Slash has remained a relatively niche grassroots movement. And similarly, manga publishers, were hiring or pulling fan comic makers or the doujinshi creators from grassroots communities into professional publishing in a way that didn't really happen as much for Slash. Next slide.
Okay, so I just wanted to piggyback on some of what Sandy was talking about here with the differences. And one thing that we found through our research is just the sort of the volume, I suppose, and the extent of academic interest between the two fandoms and the two art styles. So you can see here on the bottom left and the top right, we have two books, academic works published devoted specifically to boys love and manga. In contrast, visual culture on the top left and textual poachers on the bottom right, these are sort of larger anthologized texts about cultural studies and fandom studies and that kind of stuff. And each one has a like one chapter, one essay devoted to Slash. So I have yet to find like a full dissertation length or a book length academic work focused specifically on Slash. And I'd just like to make a note, if there's anybody in the audience who is aware of one, please provide that citation, because I would love to find it. I've been looking for a very long time and have yet to find anything more than an article about Slash. So that would be much appreciated. Okay, so early studies of Slash, right, found, or the early academics were asking a couple specific questions, right? It's like, who is creating this stuff? What did it serve, right? Those are the two main questions. And they found, right, we've already talked about this, and it applies to both Boys Love and Slash, right? It is primarily women, and specifically in the United States, primarily white women. And as Ann Kustritz noted, sort of dissatisfied, middle-class, underemployed, overeducated women. The next question, right, is sort of what purpose is it serving? A lot of the academics were viewing this from a feminist studies perspective, and so a lot of their arguments tended to revolve around that. And so they found, they were framing this as a lot of resistance and opposition or subversion to, right, the sort of heteronormative patriarchal views of gender and sexuality and relationships. And it also just provided a space to explore non-traditional views of gender. But it also helps create a sense of community. And I want to just take a quick note here just to sort of examine the different ways that research has been done. So I think this is really critical to our role as librarians and archivists. So fan studies really emerged in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and it was kind of a hodgepodge of different methods. So you had a feminist approach, feminist studies, gender studies, cultural studies, media studies, right? It's sort of people were pulling methodologies and tools from sort of all over the place, trying to apply them to a previously unstudied group of people. And one of the really early works, I mentioned this already, Constance Penley's work, she was working in the late 1980s and published in 1989, and she used a lot of ethnographic tools. So she was physically going out and meeting people in meet space. She was going to conventions. She was becoming parts of groups and communities, and she started collecting her own fanzines, right? So she sort of embedded herself in the communities and developed relationships with people, a lot of oral histories. So she physically had to go out and find the people and the stuff. In contrast, a little later, Justine Larbalestière did a wonderful dissertation, not on slash, but it was on women's involvement in sort of early and mid 20th century science fiction fandom generally. And her work was really enabled by the existence of a large pulp magazine collection in Australia. And so she was able to use those archival materials to apply a historical methodology, which is a lot of times more what we typically associate with libraries and archives. But her use of the materials was sort of a groundbreaking work, something that people hadn't really done much with in terms of science fiction fandom up to that date. And I will pass it back to Sandy here.
Yeah, and I just want to briefly talk about this chart on this slide before we move forward. So this is a chart that was from a survey by user Centrum Lumina, and they were surveying users of Archive of Our Own. So if you're not familiar with AO3, it is one of the largest fanfic websites out there, and it's actually a really crucial part, I think, of the fandom. It was so, it has such a big impact that it even won a Hugo Award last year. And the Hugo Awards are one of the most, prestigious awards in the sci-fi community. So this was a survey of over 10,000 users, like a lot of people. And what it's demonstrating is that readers and creators of slash fanfic have way more diversity than researchers originally thought. And for both slash and BL, there's this idea that it's all about straight women for straight women, but surveys like this demonstrate that demographic has been changing, especially because these fandoms have been around for decades now. So I'm just really excited to share that with folks. Okay, so next slide. Now I'm going to pivot to talking about some of the academic research that has been done in the BL fandom in a nutshell, because there's a lot to cover. But let's talk about the early studies. So the earlier studies were really focusing on asking, why do fans identify with these characters? There was almost a sense of like pathologizing this fandom. And there was an idea that, it was about a focus on this perversion, so to speak. So the idea was that women could only explore these aspects of their sexuality through the male image because society was restricting their own sexuality. Nowadays, the studies are focusing way more on the agency of fans and how fans are exploring their sexualities by analyzing the BL narratives, not the characters so much. So what we see on the left-hand side of the screen is a quote from scholar Kazuko Suzuki, who speculated that the abandonment of the female body via the depiction of male homosexual relations emerged as a result of disappointment with a society characterized by sexual oppression. So there was a belief that Japanese women, since all the early studies were done in Japan, were so oppressed by society that they could only experience and explore their sexual fantasies through the proxy of male bodies. And then Japanese feminist theorist Ueno Chizuko takes this, a few steps forward by saying, or by employing psychoanalytic theory to analyze yaoi manga otaku, or superfans, and she found them to be suffering from infantile narcissism and associated schizophrenic tendencies. So this is reported in Sharon Kinsella's dissertation, and Kinsella, blatantly disagrees with this perspective, and I also disagree with that perspective. But I do mention it because I think it's important to remember or to think about how far, perceptions of the fandom have come. So these fandoms were really revolutionary. They were creating a space for women to engage in sexual exploration from a feminine gaze. And that was threatening to scholars who had preconceived notions or ideas about what female sexuality should look like or what it should be. And as I was mentioning, more recent studies have pivoted to asking, how do fans identify with these narratives that at their core disrupt heteronormativity? So we start to see scholars incorporating more queer theory, which is really exciting. And for those who aren't familiar with it, in a nutshell, queer theory is about challenging our preconceived notions of the binary. So anthropologist Patrick Galbraith kind of described queer theory as encompassing the unencompassable fluidity that exists outside of normative paradigms. So this is a really vast description, but I like it. I think it does a good job of trying to bring it all together in a nutshell. And I have a quote here from one of the scholars who's working in queer theory for BL and fandom, and that's Andrea Wood. And so she writes, BL manga are not simply queer because they depict homoerotic love stories between men, but rather because they ultimately reject any kind of monolithic understanding of gendered or sexual identity. At the same time, erotic fantasies about love between beautiful and often androgynous young men transgress and queer how and what their supposedly straight female readers are expected to fantasize about sexually. I also want to emphasize that modern research into BL is going way beyond the psychology or this idea of, why are women into this? They're really talking about how the BL fandom can be used to subvert authority, to promote community building, and to help folks engage in creative self-expression. Next slide. Oh, actually, I'm going to take over screen share from here because we are going to go into a little activity. So let's take over. If you all bear with me. Okay, so we want to have a little bit more interaction with our audience here today. So I'd like to ask if everyone could please open up a new window in your browser and go to this web address. It's polev.com/SCUA, or if you just have a cell phone on you, if you want to text SCUA to 22333, you'll be able to join in and participate in this exercise. So what we're asking is that you read this manga panel here, and remember to read from right to left if you're not familiar with manga. And then we just want to know in one word, what is your gut reaction to this picture? And we should see the results start to come up on the screen. And this is completely anonymous, so feel free to be as blunt or as honest as you'd like to be. Nice, got our first response. This is going to build a word cloud. So as folks, type in stuff, it'll be interesting to see. Oh, I like the emoticon.
Yeah, so the web address, once again, is polev, polev.com/SCUA. That's polev.com/SCUA. Oh, yes, it just got dumped into chat.
Oh, cool. Thank you. So I'll just give it a few more seconds, but we got some really cool results here. I like kinky, confused, abrasive. But horny is a big one. Yeah, I agree with that one. Okay. So I'll go ahead and start moving on to the next part of our presentation because I know we're running out of time and I want to make sure we have time to cover it all. But thank you everyone for your participation. Andrea, do you want to take over the screen share from here? Thank you. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and, whoa, what just happened? Ooh, sorry, I just lost my notes, but that's okay. So this next slide is about a framework that we are using in our article, and we call this viscerality. So we define viscerality as the physical reactions or the gut feelings that you get when you encounter certain taboo or quote unquote forbidden materials, typically of a sexual nature. So some of the feelings that they can elicit are things like arousal or maybe discomfort. We saw a few good examples of that in the exercise we just did. And this kind of correlates with the slang that you see in the fanfic community, which is lemon. So maybe some folks are familiar with it. I know it's a little bit of an older term, but I think that the lemon is a really interesting term because it refers to like the graphic sex scenes that we see in some of the fanfic. And that's what you see in this little photo here, or this little picture of, you know, one character saying yaoi and one saying hard, and then together lemon. So when you have like those really graphic scenes, that's lemon. And I think lemon is a very visceral word. You know, it makes you think of something that's really sour or that's just very like, you know, acidic. And so it almost, your face gets scrunched up. And so it creates a visceral response in you. And we're borrowing this framework of viscerality from a scholar named Zeb Tortorici. And he was writing about viscerality in terms of colonial archival documents, specifically documents about sins against nature. So this is colonial New Spain, the 19th century, the Inquisition era. And these sins were things like bestiality, sodomy, necrophilia. And so he was talking about how all these documents that were, you know, documenting these crimes they were treated differently by people because of the way they make us feel, because of these visceral reactions that they elicit in people. So this is a quote from his article. Historians and archivists constantly come into contact with archival references and documentation that elicits some visceral response. In ignoring this, however, they unwittingly regulate such representations of bodies and desires to the margins of archival ontology and historical inquiry. So I am not saying that BL or slash are equivalent to sins against nature by any means, but I do think that there are aspects of the fandoms that create visceral responses in people. And we kind of saw that in the exercise with some of the folks' reactions, kind of confused, uncomfortable. So I think that especially in the cases of the BL fandom that are a little darker, so maybe folks in the fandom know there are certain works that are labeled as non-con or non-consensual, and that's where we start to get some of the scenes that are a little bit more, you know, rape fantasy, gangbangs, abuse, or other sorts of really difficult topics. And I think some people are really surprised, like, why are there things like non-con in a community that's otherwise super progressive, super open, and like supportive? And there's actually a lot of interesting scholarship on that topic, which we don't have time to go into today. But I do think that it's important to keep those things in mind when we think about, like, why aren't archives, you know, archiving this material? Sometimes it's because of those visceral reactions that lead us to jump to conclusions. I also want to mention that when we talk about visceral materials, we, especially of a sexual nature, we are talking about things like pornography or erotica. And there already exists a tradition in libraries and archives of the rare book world about collecting erotica and porn, but whose perspectives are really being preserved here. In our research, we found that way more institutions are collecting things like Playboy, you know, Playboy Empire magazines, than they are LGBTQ plus pornography or queer pornography. And so it's indicating that even though libraries, you know, are open to sexual content, it's really only open to sexual content that comes from a white heteronormative gaze. So we really want to challenge that. And I'll pass it off to Andrew.
Yeah, so just taking that a step further, thinking about queerness and non-heteronormative materials, right, representing other perspectives, they're just generally not widely collected in special collections and archives. Outside of a few specific, you know, sort of specialist repositories or some more grassroots collections. And there's a really good observation by Alana Cumbier in some of her research, where she found that if queerness even shows up in the archives, it is usually found in the places that deviance is measured. Right, and so this is touching on some of the research that Zeb Tortorici was doing too, right? Thinking about right, these sins against nature concept, right? It's always a pathologization, pathologization of the queer perspective. And so there's this real trend of perpetuating this otherness and marginalization. So we also have to look at these materials and think of how the viscerality comes into play when we're thinking about, just working as professionals, right, as librarians and archivists who encounter this material every day, or not necessarily every day, but just in our daily work. We also think about how does this impact a researcher, right? If somebody comes in, maybe they're looking for this kind of material, maybe they're not, but there is a very real impact. And there's sort of an incongruity between the rather sterile and officious, aspects that we think of when we think of libraries and archives, especially archives, or special collections departments, and then, right, this sort of embodied, visceral nature of some of these materials. And so we have to wrestle with that as professionals and scholars, and we have to recognize that those people coming in to use materials are interacting with these in specific ways too. And so it makes for sometimes a very difficult research environment, but one that we all have to sort of work together to try and get through. And we definitely want to make a strong statement here, right, that avoiding collecting these materials only perpetuates this historical trend of pathologizing queerness and the other historically marginalized groups. And so this is definitely where we see in the profession some of that change that we were talking about in terms of our evolving collection development practices, right? Having this new perspective and understanding the importance of collecting materials like this. Next slide. All right, so with some of these concepts in mind and with a better understanding of what we're talking about here, we can look at some of our collections and think about how they came to UCR.
And I just want to point out real quick, I know we're at time, it's already 4 p.m., but we still have probably about like 10 minutes left. So if folks, if you got to go, we totally understand. And we're recording this, so we'll send you a link to it. You can watch it later, but I believe we'll be here to finish it. So if folks want to stick around an extra 10 minutes, feel free to do so.
And our apologies for running over. As you can see, there's a lot to cover. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk just briefly here about the Kirchbach collection. And earlier in the presentation, we showed that excerpt right sort of at the top of the presentation from the donor correspondence and how that donor encountered a fair bit of resistance when she was looking for a home for her collection of slash materials. And the Eden collection really did end up being a great fit. But like I said at the beginning, it's hard for us to argue that the slash element was really any sort of motivator for why it ended up here. It was rather clear from the correspondence with the donor, and from what we know of our collections just generally, that it was first seen as an addition to our already fairly large fanzine collection. And then secondly, it was a complement to an already substantial amount of sort of material Star Trek culture, collectibles, action figures, and other materials of that kind. And so those were really the two primary elements that sort of attracted this collection to UCR. And it was really, the slash element was sort of a tertiary and supplemental aspect. And we should also note that at the time, the slash collection, the KS collection, was sort of seen as a complement to an LGBTQ collection that we already had in the Special Collections Department. And so it was sort of seen as supplemental or complementary to some already gay materials specifically. Although we have, as we have hopefully highlighted well enough at this point, that that homosexual or gay aspect of KS is sort of tenuous at best, right? And so there was sort of a misunderstanding in a lot of ways of what this material was. But we do want to acknowledge that we are certainly happy that it ended up here. And it's better that it's here than nowhere, for sure. But it's just hard to say that slash was a motivating element for why it ended up where it did.
And then I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about how we got the BL manga in UCR Special Collections. So half of it came from our Fred Patton collection. And if you don't know who Fred Patton was, he was a huge sci-fi anime and manga historian. He played an instrumental role in bringing manga and anime to the US. He actually brought a lot of Japanese language manga and sold it in his store in LA, which was called Wonder World Books. And he helped license a lot of the anime for TV broadcast and for video release in the US. He was even a friend of Osamu Tezuka, who I'm sure everyone knows is a really prolific manga artist, cartoonist, and animator, known as like the godfather of manga in Japan. So he had connections and he was really embedded in the community. So getting his archive was a huge deal for us. And he donated over 7,000 manga with his papers. And none of the documentation noted that any of it was BL. I don't know if we ever would have found out that it was BL if we didn't, know what we were looking for or happened to come across it on our own. So it was kind of a fortuitous turn of events. It wasn't intentional that we got this material. It came along with a larger collection, but it's actually a really great thing that it was here. The other BL manga that we have were purchased through this Alternative Futurisms initiative. And this initiative provided funds to help diversify our collection. So the goal was to purchase materials that were more diverse from the LGBTQ+ community. And I think this is a great initiative. And I think it's awesome that we were able to purchase BL manga through it. But I want to point out that, like my colleague Andrew was saying, it's not always interchangeable. Not all scholars and not all fans agree that BL manga is queer. And in some cases, perhaps it is and perhaps it's not. But as you can see in these screenshots, these are screenshots from the receipts of those manga purchases. And if you can see, I know it's a little hard because there's writing, a watermark over it, but the first one says there, it just describes it as gay manga, graphic novel. It does say yaoi, but if you just look at this and you don't know a lot about the fandom or about what BL is, you might just say, oh, gay manga, okay, it's LGBTQ+, I'll buy it. So I think it's kind of easy to superficially just look at the fandom and say, oh yeah, that's gay, that's representative of that community. When in reality, as we can see, there's a really complex fandom involved here. So next slide. Okay, so this is kind of the final part of our presentation, but we just kind of wanted to bring it back to the question of why should libraries and archives collect this material? Because that was the whole point of us writing this article, was to encourage more of our colleagues to take these materials seriously and to value them and to value the impact of fandom. So we really want to go beyond these traditional expectations of diversity and inclusion. We recognize that libraries and archives are overwhelmingly white and that they really replicate a heteronormative male gaze. So if we acquire more fandom materials like Slash and BL, then we're affirming that the female gaze and queer sexualities have a place in the archive. It's also really important to us as an institution that collects fandom and collects material about the sci-fi or speculative fiction community, that we make sure our collections are representative of all areas of that community and representative of what actual people and communities are doing nowadays. And I'll pass it to Andrew from here.
Oh, you want to go back one slide? Yeah, perfect. So thinking about getting that sort of a better snapshot or having a more inclusive collection that's more representative of actual fandoms, it's important to think also about the relationships that are going on within fandom. And so, right, we think of fandom, it's not a monolithic group. It's easy to sort of fall into the trap that you have, right, in any sort of dynamic. You have sort of a majority or a center, and you have groups on the periphery or on the margins. But there's always, these aren't static relationships. There's always dynamic conversations going on, a lot of dialogue, and people move, from, people or concepts will move from the center to the outside, or from the outside to the inside. And so this is very fluid, and it can be difficult to make sure that you're capturing some of that as we're thinking about our collection development policies and the types of materials to include in the archives. and it's really important for us as cultural heritage and as a cultural heritage or historical institution to document these types of shifts and activities. And this leads us to the last point here, back to the academic realm and research, which is to say that research can really only be done on or with the materials that are available or the materials that are present. And I think going back to the Justine Larbalestier dissertation is a good example. She was only able to do the work that she did, which was fairly groundbreaking, because of the large science fiction, specifically Pulse magazine collection that she used in Australia. So we feel that that the inclusion of materials of the kind that we've talked about today, and the continuing collection of these types of materials, is a real opportunity for new kinds of research, right? We see our collections sitting here waiting for somebody to use in a similar way that Larbalestier used those pulps, to come out with another sort of groundbreaking dissertation type of work. And I think from there, we're going to open it up to questions.
Yeah, I just want to sort of share that everyone has been so active in the Padlet. It's been really fun. Seeing what you guys are sharing there, we have people joining from all over California and the world, which is really cool. So thanks everyone for participating that way. And we do have some time for questions. If, I know we've gone over, but we're happy to take a few questions. If anyone wants to unmute themselves, Sandy, can you do the allow unmute feature?
Yeah, I think we also have some questions in the Padlet if we want to start with that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just figured we would let everyone talk if they wanted to, but yeah, we can start with the Padlet. Someone in the Padlet wanted to know if the collection includes online manhwa BL that are free, like in services like Webtoon.
Yeah, unfortunately, it does not. We might actually have some manhwa. Like, I think it's just a matter of knowing what you're looking for, because the archive is so vast. And if it's not labeled as, as that term, then when we search the computer, there's no way we'll ever find it. So the way that I found the BL manga just happened to be like walking by the shelf, and I was like, hey, I recognize that title. And then I was like, oh, wow, how did this get here? And that kind of like, started this whole article and this whole like research journey. But it would be great to acquire, I think, some of that.
Yeah, I'll also jump in there and say for the online aspect, at least, so for the manga, we have copyright issues for one, right? Digitizing and making publicly accessible those materials that are published and under copyright. And then with the Slash community, a lot of what was going on, people were using pseudonyms, or things were published in pretty obscure zines that didn't have wide circulation. And so there was sort of this, maybe an assumption of a safe space and anonymity, right? Because otherwise you could definitely be outing people or doing some other things by, digitally publishing some of these old print stories. So there is sort of a privacy concern related with some of this, and also just the typical copyright issues that you run into with digitizing any published works.
Great. Somebody's also asking in the Padlet if we accept donations of BL.
Oh, that's a good question for Andrew as the archivist, the official archivist. What do you think?
Yeah, I think for sure, especially if it's something that we know is BL, and also especially in these sort of uncertain budgetary times, it's not always easy to buy stuff. But yeah, we have a pretty substantial Slash collection, and I'd say we don't have a particularly large BL collection. So being able to expand that would be great, especially as Sandy was saying, it's hard to know from the catalog necessarily that it is BL. So knowing that upfront is always great. And if you have questions about that kind of stuff, or you want to reach out to us, you can email myself or Sandy, either one of us, or you could just email special collections@ucr.edu.
Okay, someone also, I think we'll do one more question from the Padlet, which is somebody says, yaoi often refers to the more explicit side of the BL genre. Will you also attempt to include shonen? I'm probably not saying this correctly. I apologize. The more romantic / non-explicit side of BL, or even bara, BL created primarily by gay men for the gay male audience.
Yeah, definitely. I think we would love to get that. The BL that we got from Fred Patton, I really don't know why he had the issues that he had. It could have been he was an avid writer, so maybe he was planning to do reviews. A lot of them are older BL titles, as you might have known or caught on because I included the titles in the presentation. So I don't think he had a lot of like newer things, but we would definitely be interested in having more of the diversity in the fandom.
Are we allowed to ask something real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Actually, I just wanted to comment real quick because I've had a lot of Japanese peers that are MLM as well and have been pushing since, because BL has been become really popular during the quarantine, I've noticed, especially with TikTok and everything. And oftentimes a lot of the terms are misused and such. For example, the terminology bara is actually a slur in Japan, while shonenai is like predatory in Japan, and yaoi is actually very outdated. I do have like threads and such for those that have sources for those information and everything, but I just wanted to like comment it real quick because oftentimes because we're in America, we normalize these terms a lot to the point where we sometimes end up ignoring when Japanese MLM are speaking up and saying, yeah, don't use these terms because if you use them in Japan, people will look at you like, oh, what are you doing? I just wanted to comment that real quick because I noticed that we use those terms a lot in the presentation, but those are very outdated. It's all BL.
Yeah, thank you for that, Donna. It is really important to keep in mind like how terms change and evolve over time. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I'll say too, right? We're dealing at a sort of institutional speed at a university library, which is much slower than the speed of fandom. So things change a lot in fandom, and it takes us a little while to catch up in a lot of ways. But it is certainly good to know. We don't want to be giving people incorrect information. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I think that pretty much concludes our presentation. I did drop a link to the chat to a survey, and we'd really appreciate any feedback that you might want to share there. Other than that, I think we'll stay here for a few minutes in case anyone wants to talk a little bit more about anything that we covered today. You're welcome to do that if you want to unmute yourself and chat about any of these topics. We'll stick around for a few minutes, but if not, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time and all your feedback. This has been amazing. So thank you.